The smoke rose steady from the stone chimney while Callum McCready stood in snow that reached his knees, watching the orange glow pulse through his cabin's single window as temperatures dropped to 50 below zero. 3 miles east, Angus Tillman was burning his last chair to stay alive in a cabin built the way every trapper in the Montana Territory built them, and he was still freezing. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The frost had crept inside. Callum McCready noticed it first when he pushed open the door of Duncan Farrow's cabin on the morning of January 19, 1848. Ice crystals covered the interior walls in delicate patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The fire pit still held warm ashes. Duncan sat in his chair near the hearth, frozen solid, his hands still extended toward heat that had failed to save him. Callum stood in the doorway for a long time, trying to understand what he was seeing. He and Duncan had been trapping partners for 6 years. They had survived blizzards, close calls with grizzlies, a flash flood that nearly swept away their entire season's catch, and countless other dangers that came with working the beaver streams of the northern Montana Territory. Duncan knew how to survive. He was careful, experienced, and never took unnecessary risks. Yet here he sat, dead in his own cabin, despite having done everything right. The evidence told a clear story. Duncan had kept the fire burning. The ash pile was substantial, indicating hours of continuous flame. He had burned firewood first, then moved to furniture when the cold became unbearable. The table was gone. 2 chairs were missing. Floorboards near the door had been pried up and fed to the flames. Duncan had fought for his life with every resource available, and it had not been enough. The cabin itself was standard construction. Horizontal logs notched at the corners, stacked to form walls roughly 8 feet high. The logs were pine, 10 to 12 inches in diameter, creating walls of single log thickness. Mud and moss had been pressed between the logs as chinking, though much of it had dried and cracked over the 2 years since Duncan had built the place. A simple pole and bark roof kept out rain and snow. 1 door, 1 small window covered with oiled hide. It had taken Duncan and a helper 4 days to build. The temperature outside had dropped to 45 below zero 3 days earlier and had not risen above 30 below since. The cold snap was unusual even for Montana in January, but not unprecedented. Every few years, Arctic air descended and lingered, creating conditions that tested every aspect of frontier survival. Callum examined the frozen interior while waiting for his body to warm enough to move Duncan outside. The single log thickness walls conducted cold directly from outside to inside. He could see frost patterns on the interior surface of the logs themselves. The gaps between logs created channels for frigid air to infiltrate. The door fit poorly in its frame. The hide-covered window offered minimal insulation. The entire structure fought a losing battle against the temperature outside. Duncan had burned enough fuel to heat 3 normal cabins. The problem was not the fire. The problem was that heat escaped as fast as it was generated, leaking through gaps, conducting through frozen logs, radiating away into the vast cold that pressed against every surface. Callum buried Duncan that afternoon on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped together. The ground was frozen solid. He built a cairn of stones instead of digging. As he worked, placing stone after stone, a single thought repeated in his mind with increasing insistence. The cabin had killed Duncan as surely as if it had been a predator. Callum spent the next 3 weeks examining cabins, not living in them, not admiring their construction, but studying them the way a doctor might study a diseased organ, looking for the point where function failed. Other trappers thought grief had broken something in him. They watched him pace around abandoned structures, pressing his hands against logs, peering at chinking, measuring wall thickness with a stick marked in inches. Angus Tillman told anyone who would listen that McCready had lost his sense. But Callum was not grieving in the way others assumed. He was angry. Duncan had died following every rule, doing everything correctly, and it had not mattered. The accepted wisdom of frontier cabin construction had failed, and no one seemed interested in asking why. They called it bad luck, unusual weather, an act of God. Callum called it a problem that could be solved. He started with Duncan's cabin, spending hours inside the frozen structure. He measured the logs, 10 inches in diameter, creating walls 10 inches thick. He examined the notching at corners, seeing how the joints left gaps that chinking could never fully seal. He studied how the horizontal logs created a grain direction that conducted temperature efficiently from outside surface to inside surface. Wood was not a perfect insulator, especially when frozen solid. A 10-inch thickness was not enough. He visited other cabins within a day's travel. They were all variations on the same design. Some had better chinking. Some had thicker logs, perhaps 12 inches. Some had more carefully fitted corners. But the fundamental architecture was identical. Horizontal logs, notched corners, single log thickness walls, minimal insulation value. They worked adequately in moderate cold, failed partially in severe cold, and could become death traps in extreme conditions like the cold snap that had killed Duncan. The trading post at Cutler's Creek served trappers from a 50-mile radius. Callum visited in early February and found Murdoch Kinney, the post operator, tallying inventory. He asked Murdoch how many men had died in the recent cold snap. Murdoch consulted his records. 4 confirmed deaths. 3 more trappers had not appeared for their usual supply runs and were presumed dead. 2 had survived only by abandoning their cabins and walking to the post, arriving with severe frostbite. 9 men dead or maimed because the cold snap had lasted 2 weeks instead of 3 days. Callum asked Murdoch if anyone was talking about building different cabins. Murdoch looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Men talked about weather and luck, not construction methods. Cabins were built the way they had always been built. That was how things worked." Callum left the trading post with a clear understanding. He could talk about the problem until his voice gave out, and no one would listen, or he could solve it himself and show them something that worked. He chose the latter. The question was not whether traditional cabins were inadequate. The question was, what design could keep a man alive when temperatures dropped to 50 below and stayed there? He had 4 months until winter returned to find an answer. Spring came late to the Montana Territory in 1848. Snow lingered through March, and April brought freezing rain that turned the trapping trails into rivers of mud. Callum worked his trap lines mechanically, his mind elsewhere. Every cabin he passed became a subject of study. He measured wall thickness with his hands, examined corner joints, noted how chinking had failed. Other trappers noticed his strange behavior, but said nothing to his face. Behind his back, they whispered that grief had damaged him. By late April, Callum had accumulated observations but no solutions. Traditional cabin construction had one overwhelming advantage that explained its universal adoption. It was fast. 2 men could fell trees, notch logs, and stack walls in 3 to 4 days. A man alone could manage it in a week. Speed mattered when winter approached, and shelter became urgent. Any alternative design would need to be buildable by one man with basic tools and available materials. The insight came during a spring storm in early May. Callum had stacked his winter firewood supply against the north side of his cabin months earlier, covered with canvas to keep it dry. The storm brought heavy wet snow, unusual for the season. He watched through his window as snow accumulated on the woodpile, building up 6 inches, then 8, then nearly a foot. The canvas sagged under the weight, but held. The stacked wood beneath remained stable. After the storm passed, Callum examined the woodpile closely. The snow had not damaged the stacked logs. Instead, it had compressed slightly, forming a dense white blanket over the pile. Where snow touched wood, it had partially melted from the insulating effect of the dry timber beneath, then refrozen into a harder layer. The entire mass, snow and wood together, formed a remarkably solid structure. He pulled back the canvas and studied the stacking pattern. The firewood was a mix of split pieces and round, unsplit logs, cut to roughly 18-inch lengths. The split pieces lay flat against each other. The round pieces nestled into gaps, creating a tight, irregular matrix. Air spaces existed between many pieces, but the overall effect was a dense, stable mass. He pressed his hand deep into the pile. Even several layers down, the wood remained dry. An idea formed. It seemed absurd at first, the kind of thought that comes from exhaustion or desperation. But the more Callum considered it, the more sense it made. A cabin was meant to keep a person warm and dry. The stacked firewood accomplished both. It held its shape under heavy snow. It stayed dry despite weather. It created natural air pockets that could trap heat. Most importantly, it could be built thick. Not 10 inches thick like a single log, but 2 feet thick, 3 feet thick, whatever was needed to hold warmth inside. What if a cabin was not built from horizontal logs at all? What if it was essentially a structured, livable version of this woodpile, shaped and contained to create shelter? The innovation seemed so simple it felt wrong. Nothing that obvious could have been overlooked by generations of frontier builders, yet there it was, demonstrated by a pile of firewood and spring snow. Callum made the mistake of explaining his idea before building it. He rode to the trading post at Cutler's Creek in mid-May, when trappers gathered to sell their spring catches and stock supplies for summer work. Murdoch Kinney's post served as the unofficial meeting place for men who spent most of their time alone in the wilderness. Conversation flowed as freely as the whiskey Murdoch sold at inflated prices. Angus Tillman was there, holding court near the stove despite the warm spring air. He had survived the winter cold snap by burning everything movable in his cabin and counted himself lucky. Fergus Brawley sat nearby, working on a knife blade with a whetstone. Lachlan Dowd was restocking his powder and lead supplies. Half a dozen other trappers occupied the space, talking about beaver populations and the best streams for the coming season. Callum waited for a lull in conversation, then described what he planned to build. A cabin with walls made from stacked firewood, not horizontal logs, but actual firewood pieces stacked tight in a frame, creating walls 2 to 3 feet thick. An A-frame design that would shed snow and distribute weight, thick enough to hold heat inside, even when temperatures dropped to deadly levels. The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then Angus Tillman laughed, a sharp bark that filled the trading post. Others joined in. Fergus Brawley looked up from his knife and shook his head slowly. Lachlan Dowd grinned and said something to the man next to him that Callum could not hear but could easily imagine. Angus found his voice first. "You planning to build a cabin or stack your winter wood? Because it sounds like you cannot decide which." More laughter. He continued, warming to the audience. "What happens come December when you need firewood? You going to tear down your walls to feed your fire? That is a peculiar way to keep warm, McCready. Burn your house from the inside out." Fergus Brawley spoke without looking up from his whetstone. "Man can build a proper cabin in 4 days. How long you planning to spend on this woodpile house? Month? 2 months? You will still be stacking wood when snow flies, living in half a cabin like a damn fool." Callum tried to explain the thermal mass principle, how thick walls would hold heat, how air gaps would insulate, how the design would save lives. Angus interrupted him. Duncan died because the cold was brutal and his luck ran out. That happens. You build whatever fool thing you want, but do not pretend it is science. It is grief making you strange. The conversation moved on. The trappers returned to discussing normal topics, practical matters, things that made sense. Callum bought his supplies from Murdoch and left. As he rode away from Cutler's Creek, he could hear laughter drifting from the trading post. He knew they were talking about him. He knew they thought he had lost his mind. He also knew he would build the cabin exactly as planned, They could mock all they wanted. Words would not keep a man warm when winter came. Callum began construction on the first day of June, 1848. He selected a site on elevated ground near a clear stream with good drainage and sight lines in all directions. The location made water hauling more difficult, but it would keep the cabin above potential flooding and allow him to see approaching weather or wildlife. The first task was building the frame that would contain the firewood walls. He spent 3 weeks cutting and shaping thick pine poles for the A-frame skeleton. The frame needed to be substantially stronger than typical cabin construction because it would support tremendous weight. Stacked firewood was heavy, and snow accumulation would add more. He notched the poles carefully, creating joints that locked together under compression. The A-frame shape emerged slowly, a triangular structure with a steep pitch that would shed snow naturally. Inside the main frame, he built smaller compartments using lighter poles. These created triangular and wedge-shaped bins that would hold the stacked firewood. The compartments prevented the entire wall from shifting if one section settled. They also allowed him to build the walls in stages rather than attempting to stack the full height at once. By late June, the skeleton was complete. It looked strange, a wooden framework waiting to be filled. The next phase consumed most of the summer. Callum needed an enormous quantity of firewood, far more than one man typically cut for a winter. He worked from dawn until dark, felling trees, limbing them, cutting them into 18-inch sections. Some pieces he split, creating flat surfaces that would stack tightly. Others he left round, knowing they would fill gaps and create better interlocking. The work was monotonous and backbreaking. His hands developed calluses on top of calluses. Other trappers occasionally passed by his building site. Most stopped to watch for a few minutes, shook their heads, and continued on. A few offered comments. "Still at it, McCready?" Or, "That is a lot of firewood for one winter." No one offered to help. Callum did not ask. This was his project, his solution to a problem only he seemed to recognize. By mid-August, he had cut enough firewood to begin filling the compartments. He started at the bottom, stacking pieces carefully. Split wood went in first, creating a relatively flat base layer. Round pieces filled gaps and added irregular strength. He worked his way up slowly, ensuring each section was tight and stable before moving higher. The walls grew inch by inch, gaining mass and solidity. The stone chimney took another 2 weeks. Callum gathered flat stones from the creek bed and built a proper firebox and flue. The chimney rose through one wall section, integrated into the structure itself. He included a smoke shelf inside the chimney throat to prevent downdrafts and improve heating efficiency. The narrow flue would create good draft while minimizing heat loss. By late September, the cabin was nearly complete. The firewood walls stood solid, 2.5 feet thick. He had installed a small insulated door and a single small window. Damaged pelts from previous trapping seasons hung along the lower roof edge as wind barriers. 4 months of work. The structure looked like nothing else in the territory. Callum moved into the cabin on October 3, 1848. The first night he built a small fire in the stone fireplace, more out of habit than need. The evening was cool but not cold, typical for early autumn in Montana. He sat on his sleeping platform and watched the flames, wondering if the months of work would prove worthwhile, or if Angus Tillman had been right to call him a fool. The fire burned for perhaps 2 hours before he let it die to coals. Normally, in a traditional cabin, the temperature would drop quickly once the flames went out. The thin walls offered little thermal retention. By morning, the interior would match the exterior cold. Callum had experienced countless nights of waking to see his breath fog in the darkness. That first night was different. The cabin stayed warm, not blazing hot, but comfortably warm. He woke once in the night and noticed the difference immediately. No drafts moved through the space. The air felt still and temperate. He checked the fireplace, just coals, barely glowing, yet the cabin maintained heat. By morning, the interior had cooled somewhat, but remained far warmer than outside. Callum stepped through the door into crisp autumn air and felt the temperature difference like a physical boundary. 20 degrees outside, perhaps 50 inside, even with the fire dead for hours. The thick firewood walls were holding heat, radiating it back into the living space slowly as they cooled. Over the following weeks, as autumn progressed toward winter, Callum documented the cabin's performance. He burned fires in the evening, let them die overnight, and measured how long the space stayed comfortable. The pattern held consistent. The massive walls absorbed heat during burning periods and released it gradually over 8 to 10 hours. He was using substantially less firewood than he had in his previous traditional cabin, despite the colder weather that November brought. The first snow came in mid-November. 6 inches fell overnight, accumulating on the steep A-frame roof and sliding off in small avalanches. Snow piled around the base of the cabin, banking against the firewood walls. Callum expected no benefit from this, but he noticed that interior temperatures became even more stable. The snow provided an additional insulation layer, reducing heat loss through the walls. December brought colder weather. Temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. Callum maintained his evening fire routine. The cabin's performance remained consistent. No drafts penetrated the thick walls. No frost formed on interior surfaces. The stone chimney, warmed by daily use, retained heat and radiated it back into the space even between fires. Other trappers endured normal winter misery in their traditional cabins. They burned fires constantly, stuffed rags in gaps, hung blankets over doors and windows, and still shivered. Callum burned modest fires and stayed comfortable. He told no one. There was no point in sharing observations that would be dismissed as exaggeration or luck. The real test would come if winter brought another cold snap like the one that had killed Duncan. Until then, he simply lived in his unusual cabin and waited. The cold arrived on January 7, 1849. Callum woke to absolute stillness, the kind of silence that only comes with extreme cold. The air outside was brittle and motionless. Trees cracked in the forest as sap froze and expanded. By midday, his breath crystallized and fell as ice dust in the sunlight. The thermometer he kept outside registered 42 below zero. The cold deepened over the following days. 45 below, 48 below. On January 10th, the mercury dropped to 50 below and stopped falling only because that was as low as the instrument measured. The cold was not weather anymore. It was a physical presence, a crushing force that turned exposed skin white in seconds and made breathing painful. Callum maintained his routine. He built an evening fire, burned it for 2 hours, let it die to coals. The cabin stayed warm. Not just survivable, but genuinely comfortable. He slept through the nights without shivering. He woke to air that was cool, but not freezing. The firewood walls, dense and thick, held the day's heat through the darkness. The stone chimney radiated warmth long after the fire died. 3 miles east, Angus Tillman was fighting for his life. His traditional cabin, identical to 100 others in the territory, had become a trap. He kept a fire roaring constantly, feeding it every piece of firewood he had stockpiled for the winter. The cabin stayed barely tolerable. Frost covered the interior walls. His water bucket froze solid despite sitting 3 feet from the hearth. He burned his spare chair, then his table. Then he started pulling up floorboards. Fergus Brawley fared slightly better. His cabin was newer, with tighter chinking, but the principle was the same. Single-log thickness walls conducted cold faster than any fire could compensate. He wore every piece of clothing he owned and still felt the cold penetrating. He rationed his firewood carefully, knowing that if he ran out, he would have to make a desperate attempt to reach Cutler's Creek or die trying. Lachlan Dowd made the attempt on January 12th. His cabin had become unlivable. Frost grew on the interior logs like silver fur. His fire consumed wood faster than seemed possible, yet provided minimal warmth. He decided his only chance was to walk the 8 miles to the trading post before his wood supply ran out completely. He dressed in layers, packed what supplies he could carry, and left at first light. He made it 4 miles before the cold defeated him. His feet went numb first, then his hands. His face stopped feeling anything at all. He stumbled off the trail and collapsed behind a windfall, knowing he was dying but unable to form a plan to prevent it. Callum knew none of this. He sat in his cabin, comfortable and warm, unaware that men were burning their homes from the inside and walking to their deaths. The cold snap continued. The thermometer stayed pegged at 50 below. Outside, the Montana wilderness became a place where traditional wisdom failed and people died. Inside his firewood walls, Callum simply waited for winter to break. The knocking came just after dawn on January 14th. Callum woke to the sound, faint and irregular, barely audible over the silence of extreme cold. He pulled on his boots and fur coat, grabbed his rifle from habit, and opened the door. Lachlan Dowd stood in the snow, swaying. His face was white except for black patches on his nose and cheeks. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. Callum pulled him inside and shut the door. The cabin was cool from the overnight hours, but still far warmer than outside. Lachlan collapsed near the fireplace. Callum built up the fire quickly, then examined his unexpected guest. Frostbite on the face, nose, and ears. Probably the hands and feet as well, though Lachlan's thick mittens and boots had provided some protection. He was hypothermic but conscious. That meant salvageable. Callum stripped off Lachlan's outer layers carefully, checking for frozen tissue. The fingers were waxy and pale, but not black. The toes looked similar when he removed the boots. Bad frostbite, painful recovery ahead, but likely no amputations. He wrapped Lachlan in blankets and positioned him near the fire, close enough for warmth, but not so close that rapid rewarming would cause additional damage. Lachlan drifted in and out of awareness for the first hour. Callum fed him warm broth when he was lucid enough to swallow. As feeling returned to his extremities, Lachlan began to moan, then cry out. The pain of thawing frostbite was intense. Callum had seen it before. There was nothing to do but endure it. By midday, Lachlan was coherent. He sat wrapped in blankets, his hands and feet throbbing with returning circulation. He looked around the cabin slowly, taking in details he had been too frozen to notice earlier. The thick firewood walls, the modest fire burning in the hearth, the comfortable temperature despite the deadly cold outside. His expression shifted from pain to confusion to something like shame. "How warm is it in here?" His voice was rough and quiet. Callum shrugged. 50 degrees perhaps, maybe a bit less. Feels like summer." Lachlan stared at the fire. "My cabin, I had a blaze twice that size and could still see my breath. How is this possible?" Callum explained the thermal mass principle while preparing more broth. The thick walls absorbed heat during burning periods and released it slowly over hours. The air gaps between firewood pieces trapped dead air, creating insulation. The A-frame design shed snow that then banked against the walls, adding more insulation. The stone chimney retained heat and radiated it back. The system worked together to create stable interior temperature with minimal fuel consumption. Lachlan listened without interrupting. When Callum finished, he was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "We mocked you at the trading post after you left. Angus made jokes for an hour. We all laughed." He paused. "You built this thing we called impossible, and it just saved my life." Callum added wood to the fire. "It is just a cabin." "No," Lachlan said, "it is not." The cold snap broke on January 17th. Temperatures rose to 0, then 10 above, then 20. What had been a killing freeze became normal Montana winter. Lachlan stayed at Callum's cabin for another week while his frostbite healed. His fingers and toes blistered and peeled but remained attached. His face developed dark scabs where tissue had frozen deepest. He would carry scars, but he would live. When Lachlan finally left to check his trap lines and salvage what remained of his cabin, he carried detailed notes. Callum had spent evenings sketching the frame design, explaining wall thickness ratios, describing the compartment system that held the firewood stable. Lachlan asked questions about every aspect. How steep should the A-frame pitch be? What length? Should the firewood pieces be cut? How thick did the walls need to be for genuine thermal retention? Word spread slowly through the scattered trapping community. 4 men had died in the cold snap. 3 others had survived only by abandoning their cabins and reaching settlements, losing toes or fingers to frostbite. Angus Tillman had burned every piece of furniture he owned and barely survived. When trappers gathered at Cutler's Creek in early February, the conversation inevitably turned to the cold and how men had endured it. Lachlan told his story, walking through 50 below cold, collapsing in the snow, somehow reaching McCready's cabin, being pulled inside to warmth that seemed impossible given the temperature outside, spending days recovering in comfort while the deadly cold continued. He showed his scarred face and damaged fingers as evidence. He described the firewood walls and how they worked. Angus Tillman listened without his usual mockery. He had spent 2 weeks in genuine terror, watching his firewood supply vanish while his cabin remained barely habitable. He had burned his table, his chairs, his spare door. He had seriously considered walking to Cutler's Creek and likely would have died making the attempt. The memory was too fresh for jokes. Fergus Brawley asked practical questions. How long had construction taken? Could one man build it alone? What tools were required? Lachlan answered what he could and admitted Callum would know better. Several trappers mentioned riding out to see this unusual cabin themselves come spring. Hamish Stroud, a quiet Scotsman who trapped the northern streams, said little during the gathering, but in late March he began building his own firewood-walled cabin. He followed Lachlan's notes closely, adapting details to his specific site and available materials. His version used slightly different compartment spacing and incorporated a false ceiling for additional insulation. The construction took him most of the summer, but by October he had a structure that functioned on the same thermal mass principle as Callum's original. Others built partial implementations. Some added thick firewood walls only on the north side of traditional cabins, where cold hit hardest. Some built traditional cabins but doubled wall thickness by adding an outer layer of stacked firewood held by a frame. The pure designs took too long for most trappers' patience, but hybrid approaches spread through 1850 and 51. At Cutler's Creek, Murdoch Kinney noted the shift. Trappers were buying more nails, more iron brackets, asking about frame construction techniques. Something had changed in how men thought about winter shelter. Callum McCready left the Montana Territory in the spring of 1853. The beaver population had collapsed from overtrapping, and silk hats had replaced felt in eastern markets. The economic foundation of the mountain man era had vanished. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness faced a choice: find new work in the territories or return to civilization. Callum chose Oregon, purchasing land in the Willamette Valley where former trappers were establishing farms and ranches. He married in 1854, a widow named Margaret, who had come west with a wagon train. They built a conventional house, raised 3 children, and lived quietly. Callum worked his land, raised cattle, and rarely spoke about his trapping years. His children knew their father had spent time in the mountains, but understood few details. The firewood cabin was never mentioned. It belonged to a different life, a different version of their father they would never know. Callum died in February of 1873 at age 64. Pneumonia took him quickly. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Salem, surrounded by other settlers who had come west seeking new lives. His gravestone listed his name, dates, and the word pioneer. Nothing about cabins or thermal mass or the winter that had changed how men built shelter in the coldest territories. but in Montana his cabin still stood. The firewood walls had settled slightly over the decades, but remained solid. The stone chimney showed cracks, but functioned. Prospectors discovered it in the 1860s and used it as a base camp. They marveled at the thick walls and unusual construction. Some added firewood to sections that had shifted, maintaining the structure without understanding its history. The cabin served its purpose, keeping people alive through mountain winters. Hamish Stroud's cabin endured as well, and the handful of other pure firewood wall designs built by trappers who had learned from Lauchlin's story or seen Callum's original. Hybrid cabins, combining traditional log construction with firewood-insulated walls, became common enough in the northernmost regions that they stopped seeming unusual. Settlers arriving in the 1860s found these structures and recognized their superior performance in extreme cold. The techniques persisted not through documentation or formal teaching, but through simple observation. This cabin keeps you warmer than that cabin. Build like this one. By the 1880s, the specific story had been forgotten. Old trappers like Lauchlin and Angus had died or moved on. The cold snap of 1849 became general history, a bad winter among many bad winters. But scattered through Montana, northern Wyoming, and the Canadian territories, cabins with unusually thick walls continued protecting inhabitants from cold that killed people in standard shelters. No one called them McReady cabins. Most people did not call them anything special. They were just the cabins that certain careful builders constructed when they understood that winter, in the high country, required more than tradition. The walls remembered what people forgot, that a trapper named Callum had watched his friend freeze to death and decided the accepted way of doing things was not good enough. The innovation remained, anonymous and functional, built into structures that stood solid while snow accumulated and temperatures dropped and people inside stayed warm enough to see another spring.